Hey everybody, welcome back to the Dev Marketer channel. I'm your host, J.A. Curtis, but you guys can call me Alex. Now today's video is going to be part 3 or 4, I can't remember, part 3 or 4 of this series on how to build an advanced CMS and blog system, okay? This is actually going to be the platform I use for devmarketer.io, which is my personal website. Well, not my personal website, it's the website for this channel, and it's going to actually be put to use. So this is a real world application. And like I said, we're starting and covering basically every stage in the process up to building the website. Now, I really want to get to the code just like you guys do, but we do want to make sure we do this right. And so I want to make sure that we hit everything the way we want to hit it so that it's built correctly when we actually get to the code. Now, the last video, we talked about the idea dump. This is a brainstorming session where we throw everything that we want to do or accomplish with the website onto the board. Now, we won't really focus about how long something's going to take, how practical it is, or anything. We just want to know what you and the client want to accomplish from this website. And of course, since it's the same thing in here, I just threw down all of my basic ideas on the board. Normally, you would spend a lot more time writing down all of the ideas that you have. You might have multiple revisions of where you talk to different people inside of the organization, stuff like that. But for this video, I went ahead and just accelerated it. We just spent, 15 minutes going through it. And that's the extent of the idea dump for this series. But just keep in mind that normally you might spend a week or so in this phase trying to get all the information, all of the ideas and everything that the organization wants for their website and putting that all on the board. Okay, but this is what we've got for today. Let's go ahead here and make we're gonna make a new section here, and I'm gonna call this the scope of work. Now, before I get too into this, I did wanna mention kind of the process for the discovery phase, which is basically the first phase that we're in. Now, when you're building a website, I always like to break it in to 5 different phases, okay? And that's what I'm gonna write down here. The first phase is the discovery phase, okay? And that's basically what we're doing now. Now, in this phase, this is when you tend to do basically things like the idea dump. You generally will then do something called a creative brief. This is how I've always done it with the organizations I've worked in the past. And then you'll generally create something called a scope of work. Now, the idea, we already talked about basically the idea dump. That's when you just want to get all the information from everybody. You're meeting with people, you're figuring out what they want to get out of the website, and you're basically writing it down regardless of whether it might be relevant or not relevant, whether it's too difficult, whether the timeline doesn't allow for it, or whether it does. You're not worrying about that. You just want to get everything down on the board so that you have an idea for what the customer wants to accomplish. Generally, at that point, you then start to compile the information. You then now start looking at the idea dump and seeing what you can accomplish based on what the customer wants or the client wants. So this gives you an idea for what they're looking for, and now you can adapt something that's practical out of what is on what they've brought to you that they want. And that's where things like the scope of work and creative brief start to come in. Now, I used to work at an advertising agency. When I say I worked there, I was an intern there during high school or during college. And I briefly worked at this fancy advertising agency, and I was in a junior account manager there, or account representative or something. I remember it was account something. Anyway, we were the account executive. I was a junior account executive. What that meant was basically I was the assistant to the account executive, learning how basically he does stuff so that hopefully I could have that job one day. Turns out I didn't really want to work in a big organization like that, and I learned that along the way. But I did learn some valuable stuff while I was there, such as how these big organizations build websites. They do more than just websites. It's advertising campaigns, and websites were just one portion of that. But one of the most important things that I did was learn this process. And so again, we would always start with this discovery phase. And I've seen this also follow through other agencies that I've worked with that aren't even advertising agencies, even web agencies tend to follow the same pattern. Your first phase here is this discovery phase. We figure out what the customer wants. And then my job as a junior account executive I was generally the one actually interviewing the client and the team, either me alone or me with my account executive. We would do it together. But instead of bringing the entire team from the agency to talk and go over all this stuff with the client, you didn't want 5 to 10 to 20 people in the room trying to get all this information. So I would go by myself, or I'd go with the account executive, and you'd have 1 or 2 people from the agency discussing the needs of the client. And that made it a lot easier to have really good creative discussions without people getting overwhelmed or getting, like feeling like they can't say what they want to say. So it allowed us to have very candid discussions. I would write everything down on the idea dump here. That would be my stuff. And then my next job as the junior account executive was to take everything from the idea dump and figure out how it works and how we can make it work. I would take the information from that and write up a creative brief. Now, I'm skipping over this in this section in this video, but I'm just taking the time right now to explain how this would normally go. Again, I've got a team of people back at the agency, anywhere that, the copywriters, the designers, developers, all these different people that my job is to let them know what the client wants. I'm the one that talked to the client. So how do I let them know what the client wants and what we're trying to accomplish? That is through the process of creating a creative brief. And that's what we call it. So I would then write up, put pinpoints and bullets of different elements, and describe what the client wants. And I'm basically translating it from the way the client says it, which is basically like, I want a really cool website that can sell stuff, to the way the agency works, saying, okay, the client wants lead generation form, and they want bright, modern colors, flat style, things like that. And I basically am translating that to what the agency wants from what the client told me, which might be like, I really like this one website. You should go look at it. I also like this other website, and this other one. Make something similar to that. I want to be able to sell stuff, and I want to be able to call someone when they fill out a form, right? They don't really talk in the same way that the agency people talk. So my job was to basically translate that by taking all the ideas and then putting them together into the creative brief. Now, the creative brief was never seen by the client. That was only internally. So I would write the creative brief up, give it to all the people on the agency team that I'm working with, and now they would basically, it's as if they were there at the meetings that I was previously having, but they have everything that they need to know in order to appropriately deal with this customer, to this client, and give this client what they need. So it's a very important process, and you definitely don't want to push through this discovery phase, because if you do, what's going to happen is in the later stuff, you're going to end up screwing up and having to come back and redo something. And that was one of the most valuable lessons that I learned in this process, was how important it really is to have this discovery phase. And when you skip over it, you find yourself having to come back and do multiple revisions, and certain things get skipped over. Like we might say, okay, well, connecting with this certain API, it takes too long. We can't meet your time frame in order to do that. So if I skip over this phase, I would just basically pull that out of the project, and we don't really have a good discussion with the client on that. So then when he's done, or the client is done, they're wondering why it's not there. It makes it for this very complicated, difficult discussion to have. Going through this process correctly allows you to, nip all that in the bud early on and deal with it before it becomes a problem down the road, saving you time, energy, and, making the client happy, which is also very, very important. Okay, so Creative Brief was only really for internal use, and you can look at these up online. There's a lot of templates online you can find, so I'm going to skip over it because it's not really relevant for this video, and I just want to get to the point where we can start seeing a little bit more with the project. Now, the client never sees this. This is only for internal use, but the scope of work is basically my promises to the client, and that's what I want to do today. The scope of work basically outlines the time frame that we promised to accomplish everything, and then it lists everything that we're going to accomplish in every step along the way. That's what we're going to be putting together now. So the scope of work is incredibly important because it needs to cover every little thing that you promised to do with the website. And normally the discovery phase by itself is usually done without any sort of contract, or a lot of times not even done with any billing. Usually it's billed at the end. And so you're kind of doing this with in what we call good faith, basically. And this is just making sure that we're the right fit for them and they're the right fit for us. If a client wants something that we can't really do or accomplish, we want to know that before we start diving into it, allotting resources for our designers and our database architects and all that kind of stuff. We want to know early on this is the project that we can really accomplish, and also that the client's expectations are something that we can manage. If the client's expecting something that we can never deliver on, we don't want to dive into that project because it's only setting ourselves up for failure. And so it's really important to go through these steps. As stupid as they may seem, the discovery phase just lays the groundwork for the entire future of your organization and your business, and the happiness that your client is going to have with the work that you've done. So the scope of work is critical because it outlines everything you're going to do. And it's really important to let the client know that if something's not in the scope of work, that it's not going to be created. That way, 2 months from now, when they wanted to tie into some API that you didn't tie into, instead of you having to go back and try to have this revision and you fighting with the client saying, I didn't understand that that's what you wanted, you never really told me, and them saying, oh yeah, I did tell you. Now you go back to the scope of work because you have that, and you can say, hey, it's not in the scope of work. You didn't mention that when we signed the scope of work. And it makes for a very easy conversation. Okay, and you can say, hey, the scope of work is everything that we've allotted for, and so you want this to be as specific as possible. So I'm going to be doing a very brief version of it, and truthfully, this is a very advanced project that we're working on. This is a project that would take, potentially 6 months if you're working in an organization to do it, and you're working between multiple clients. It would take really 4 to 6 months to accomplish what we're about to do for this project. And so I would generally spend as long as a month on the discovery phase to make sure everything is the way the client wants and the way that we want it, and that we have all the timeframes in place correctly. Okay, so now that we got that out of the way, this is the first stage of your project. Well, what are the next stages? So after we finish the discovery phase, the important thing to do next is the design phase. Okay, so with the design phase, you're generally looking at starting with the wireframes. And the wireframes are going to be generic outlines and blocks, basically showing how we're going to lay out a page. It's more about the layout than it is about the design. You're not doing any design elements. You're generally going to draw generic blocks and headings, and even use things like lorem ipsum text or just like random lines to indicate text and stuff like that. This gives a general layout of the website, allows you to create the pages and start to organize the very high level of what the website will become. So wireframes are really, really important and really good because it allows you to hit these major elements of things like major organization early before you put a lot of resources into design. So for example, on the homepage, let's say if you skipped over the wireframe and let's say you make this elaborate carousel, well, then you go to the client doesn't want a carousel, he just wants a hero. Well, now you wasted a lot of resources on designing a fancy carousel that might have taken 2, 3, 5 hours, whereas with the wireframe, it wouldn't really take more than a couple seconds, right? So you can throw it up, you get approval from the client, they can bounce back if they wanted to do something else, and not really any time was wasted. It allows you to iterate really, really quickly. Very, very convenient. So wireframes are really important. We will go through this, after we finish the discovery here, after we get the scope of work done. And then we're going to go into the wireframes, and I'll show you guys how to mock all that together. And there's a million ways you can do wireframes, but the concept basically is the same. This is going to allow us to lay out the different pages that we want, to figure out which pages we actually do need, and then to figure out the general layout without getting into the weeds with design and colors and all this other stuff. It's also really good. The other reason wireframes are good is because not only does it allow you to iterate quickly, but it also removes distractions from the clients. This is one of the biggest things that you'll see is if you go straight to design, I've seen this 100 times, what your clients will do is they'll come to you and they'll say, you'll give them the design and they'll say, oh, this is really good, but I was thinking, can we get the green to be more of like a bluish green? And you'll be like, yeah, sure, we can do that. And so you go ahead and you just approve that and you say, okay, that's good. Or they'll look at I'm not even joking, this happens so many times, can we get the social media buttons to be bigger? And you're like, sure, that's not a problem. I don't really care. So you're like, I can go through and do that. And you're going to get this kind of feedback. And then what's going to actually happen is after you go and you start coding it, then they're going to tell you things like, wait, why is this element so big? Wait, why is this even on this page? I didn't expect this to be on this page. They start to have those concerns down the road. And when you first show them the design, they start to have concerns about really weird things that honestly aren't that important to you at the point because they're easy to change. but that's the concerns they'll have. They were not going to talk about the overall layout. They're going to always have these concerns about, they're going to get in the weeds with things like colors and the size of little buttons, and if the buttons have box shadows and stuff. That's the stuff they want to kind of talk about for some reason whenever you jump right into design. And that's why I like to talk about the wireframe, is because with the wireframe, we pull the design out of it and we just say, hey, does this make sense? Is this the layout and the organization that you're looking for? There's no elements to look at. There's no colors. There's no, like if the button is flat or rounded or any of that, like all of that's irrelevant. There's nothing of that to see. So they're not going to comment on that because there's nothing like that to see, which kind of helps your client focus on what's important, which is the organization and layout. And that's the part we're trying to accomplish. And so by making the wireframe simple, it allows us to basically keep the client focused. And so that's one of the things that's really, really good. And that's why it's important to do the wireframes and not skip straight to the design, because it helps keep the client focused. It helps them keep focused on things that are important at that stage, which is the general layout and the general organization. Now, once that's been approved, your wireframes have been approved and you've got the layout and the organization right, then you can start spending resources on actually designing and making it look good. We're not going to actually go through and code it yet because that takes even longer. So now we're actually going to be in like Photoshop or Sketch or Adobe Experience Design, Adobe XD. We'll be in one of these programs. We'll be laying it out and actually designing them up to see how they look. And this is a really good process as well, because it's going to speed up now the process that follows this, which is when we're actually coding it. Okay, so after we do wireframes, then we're going to design. These are the design mock-ups that you've seen. You throw them on Behance. They look all cute and sexy. This is when you can actually start focusing on the look of the social media buttons, or the small specifics, like if that green needs to be more blue-green. Now's the appropriate time to worry about that, right? And the designer can focus and get all that correctly, and they can iterate through quicker than a coder can do. Okay, they can quickly change the gradient in the, from the blue to the green or whatever. They can change that quicker than a coder can to go through and change all of that stuff. Okay, they can usually do it themselves, whereas a coder would need to do that with maybe multiple people if it's a large enough project. Okay, so that's why the design is important. Now, once you get to the design, it's always important to kind of have a touch-up phase. And this will be like the revisions, and you're going to go through this. This will basically loop. You're going to design it, then you're going to send it for revisions, and then the client's going to come back with changes. You're going to redesign, or not fully redesign it, but you'll change it. Then send it to revisions, and you're going to kind of jump between these two. You're going to bounce back and forth until you get to something that the client approves. Now, once the design process has been approved, then we can move into the actual development. And the reason you want to get these done first is because design, and these can iterate quickly. You can make these changes. And now the developers can basically sit in their little box, focused on the computer. They'll have the designs in front of them, and all they need to do is replicate what's in the design. And that's way, way easier. So when they're looking at a design, let's say that you've got some gradient along your hero image, the developer can now look at the gradient, open it up, see, okay, on the one end of the gradient, it's, this hex color. On the other end of the gradient, it's this other hex color. They can put those into the code and create the gradient. They can see all of that on screen. And so they don't need to go through and try different things. They can just code what has been designed. They can also take the elements if they want to see the social media buttons. They'll look and say, okay, it's 50 by 50 pixels. Great. They create a 50 by 50 pixel element, right? It's already been designed, so they can just add the code. It makes it way, way faster. So now that you're into the development phase, then you're going to go through and you're going to actually, you'll probably break the development phase into multiple sections. So if we were going to focus on, say, this project, you would generally start with like the home page. The home page is the best page to start with. It sets the tone for the entire website. And generally the client will have the most to talk about with the homepage. That's their most important page. So it's always good to start with the homepage. After that, I like to break it into sections. And this is really good if you're building some sort of like a CRUD website, like a blog or something like that, because you can break it up by resource generally. So if you think about it this way, you can have like a blog section, and then we would have the forum section of our website. And then we would have the sharing / resources section. And then after that, you might just have your miscellaneous pages. Miscellaneous, is that right? Miscellaneous pages. This will be things like your 404 page, just to write this down. So these are things like your 404 page, your 500 error page, your login pages maybe, login, the register pages, things like that. I'm trying to think what else. These will be kind of your generic pages that you need. Maybe like a contact page. Sometimes this is like the last thing to get built is the contact page. So those are kind of your miscellaneous pages that will get thrown in that don't necessarily fit into these sections, but the client usually doesn't care too much about these. So these are kind of like good to have at the end. So they're not too concerned about the 404 page. They're not too concerned about things like the contact page and stuff, usually as long as it sends, submits the form and things like that. So I like to throw these at the end. So you'll generally break this up. And then when you're creating the scope of work, I also like to put timeframes on all this. So I would generally say, like, let's say it's February 1st. Well, I would say, okay, well, if it's February 1st when we start this, I would say we're going to finish the discovery phase by February 28th. Then the design phase will start March 1st. And then the development phase would start, and I put deadlines like that. And then in here, I would say, okay, if this starts in April 1st, I'd say the homepage is going to take a week. So April 7th, this project will be done. The blog section will take, let's say it's another week. So then April 14th, April, whatever. So you can just continue on. You set deadlines for yourself and everything like that. And then this is what will get approved by the client. And then you can make sure that we're on schedule. Once they approve that schedule, then, as long as you're on schedule, if they're wondering why you haven't added code yet, you can say, well, it's not April 1st yet. And we said we weren't starting that till April 1st. So that's why it's really cool to have that. All right. So next, not the last page. We've got our first 3 phases. The 4th phase is going to be the QA and testing. This means your development is done. This is going to go to your quality assurance, to your QA team. It might go to, I don't know, like, what do they call it? Mechanical Turks, which is like the Amazon, easy labor type of thing. You might do for a big project, you might do a, what do they call them? Shoot. Anyway, a group. You might send it to a group that, what do they call those? And then you're going to test it, make sure there's any bugs. You'll go through another process here with the QA and testing, where you're basically going to send a revision to QA. They're going to test it. QA will submit bugs or like problems that they noticed. And then generally your developers will fix and create new revision. Okay, so this is another kind of loop that will go revision. So basically, you're going to send your first revision to QA. They're going to test it. They're going to find a bug. They're going to submit it. Then it's going to go to the developers. The developers will fix it. They'll submit it as another revision, and you'll go through there until there's nothing else to note. After you get through Q&A and testing, then you're into the final stage, which is deployment. And deployment, generally, when I was working, we always allotted, of course, it depends on the size of the project. If it's just a small website, you might only allot 1 day. But sometimes we generally, for a large project, the size of this project, we generally did like a week or 3 to 4 days. And this is not only to deploy the website, but because there's always going to be some little problem that happens. Some SSL certificate doesn't authenticate, or the database is taking longer than normal, or whatever. There's always something that happens. And so that's why it's good to allot some time where you schedule nothing else to be done except deployment. And you don't schedule anything with other clients. You're dedicated to this one client for these 3 or 4 days. And you're focused, you're available, that if something goes wrong, you can jump on and solve the problem. Okay, and so deployment's also a very necessary stage. So these are the stages of building kind of a website. This is the stage that I follow. So if someone comes to me and says, hey, Alex, can you build me a website? This is the phase that I follow. So we start with the discovery phase, and we all basically do this. We don't do it for free. We will charge them for the time we put into it, but generally this is like what we call, we do this in good faith. I don't usually take a deposit for this. I would just do this project, make sure where you're even going to fit. I can usually tell pretty early on if it's not going to be a good fit. And if it's not, I don't charge at all usually, unless you get down and I've already spent 100 man hours on this, and then at the end we decide it doesn't fit, then I might charge for it. But generally I can tell pretty early on if it's not a good fit, in which case I just say, hey, the 10, 20 hours I spent on it, whatever, we'll just chalk it up to a bad experience and call it a day. So the discovery phase is normally, it's very, very important you do this. Normally by the end of it, you're going to want to have a signed contract that agrees to the scope of work. So you want to make sure the scope of work outlines everything the project's going to have. And once that's all been created, that's your commitment. And that the scope of work, we're going to create this in the next video, very on a high level. We're going to do a very basic one. It's going to outline like the homepage, when you're going to accomplish that, what elements the homepage is going to have. If it's going to tie into a specific API, we need all that information in there. If it's going to have a login or a backend or anything like that, all that information needs to be onto the scope of work to explain, so that we're agreeing to it. The company that is building the website agrees to do it, and the client agrees that that's something that they want. At the end of it, the client basically needs to sign away saying, hey, everything in the scope of work is what I want. Everything outside of the scope of work will require a revision. Okay, that's when we have to go back and do like an addendum or whatever you want to call it, where we make a modification to the scope of work, and that will affect timelines that trickle down through everything else. Okay, so that's a really important thing to do, and it helps protect you, because down the road, when a client inevitably comes up with some other idea that they dreamt of last night and they want to pretend like they had that idea all along, you can say, hey, it's not in the scope of work, I'd love to do it, can we try to fit it into phase 2 or something like that? And usually you can have that conversation pretty easily if you've got the scope of work to come back on. If you don't, then the client will always try to push you into doing something. But you need that scope of work to protect yourself into it. It also allows you that when your client also inevitably complains about the time frame that everything is taking, even though they previously agreed to it, you can point them back to it and you can say, hey, the scope of work said we're not starting this phase that you're complaining about until April 1st. It's only March 20th. We're on schedule. All right. And it allows those conversations to be pretty easy without there being any resentment on either side. So this is so important. So important. I can't reiterate how this will solve all of your problems as a web developer, a web designer, anything like that. Normally when we get into these phases, this is when we start the design phase. This is normally when I would take a deposit. Generally, depends on how long the project is. Generally 30% or like a third, 33%. If it's a short project, it would be 50%. If it's a super long project, like it's going to drag out for 6 to 8 to 12 months, then maybe only like 10% or 15%. But like I'd say as a rule of thumb, it's almost always 33%. So take 1/3 of it up front. And then generally we'll have installments along the way where they pay certain, as we hit certain milestones, then we wait for payment to continue to the next milestone. That's basically how I do it. And then generally before we do deployment, I collect at least the way I do it, I collect all the money before we do deployment. I don't deploy a website until I've been 100% paid. That'll protect you from actually getting paid. It's amazing how you actually get paid when you don't deploy a website yet. And then you promise to deploy it as soon as they pay. Then all of a sudden they find a way to pay. So anyway, you want to protect yourself here. So again, if it doesn't take too long, I may not even charge for it. If I do, I'll just bill it in to the rest of the project and it'll just get paid basically through installments. I require a deposit usually for doing this phase. The deposit is for the entire project. They're committing to the project. They've got the scope of work signed. And then as part of the contract, it would say that 33% is required up front. They pay that up front. Then we start the design phase. And then each of these might have other installments of 15%, and then the final 33% or whatever. So that's the way this project would work. All right, so that's basically the way this happens. I wanted to just kind of give you guys an idea. For those of you guys, I get a lot of questions about people wanting to start their own designing and development firms and how to do this if you're doing this freelance. Even if you're doing this freelance, I would still follow this outline. Okay, you may not need to do like the creative brief and stuff like that because you're just doing it for yourself. If you're the only person involved, then you may not need to go through it quite as extensively, but I would still follow this very well. You want the client to know these different phases. This is huge. Like, let them know that you've, entered the design phase. I expect to start the design phase on this date. We expect to start the development phase on this date. You want them to know that there's a flow. It makes you look very professional. It makes you look very experienced. It's going to also allow you to control the client if they start getting antsy. You can say, this is the flow. We've got a plan. Let me do my job. Okay? So it's really important to have these kind of outlined, and it's going to protect you even as a freelancer, doing all that kind of stuff. I also think it's really important you still do the scope of work, even as a freelancer. If you don't, you're going to find yourself in these situations where you get later, you're going to get down here, and then all of a sudden the contact page has to send to some crazy, I don't know, it has to do something crazy that you never expected and that no one's ever talked about before. And this feature all of a sudden is pivotal to this company's success or whatever, and it's going to happen, and now you're going to have to now add 2 weeks. It's going to push everything back. You're going to have to go back and redo some of these other sections because it wasn't talked about. You really want to go through and do the scope of work and make sure it's committed before you get into the rest of the project. The last thing I didn't mention here in the design phase is generally the design phase. While all this design stuff is happening, there's also usually database. If there's a database related, you'll generally have database architecture. Architecture. I spelled that way wrong. Architecture. There we go. Okay. This is generally involved as well, kind of in the design phase. If you have a large project, you might hire a DB architect. If not, you do it yourself. But you want to outline all that stuff before you get to the development phase. You want the developers to have a whole outline of the database architecture before they start. Okay? And if you're a freelancer, you still want to know that because it's going to allow you to actually organize everything. Okay? So that's the general layout that you guys want to form if you're doing any sort of web development project, even internally. I highly recommend even internally, if you're just working to build a website inside of a company that you already work for, it's really good to break this up. This is the best way to build a website. Having these steps, making sure you get all the design done before you start development, and then having sections for each development phase. Allowing you to do this will make the whole thing go way smoother, regardless of whether you're a freelancer, you're a web agency, a marketing agency, or whether you're an internal team. This is the way to build a website. Trust me, it makes your life so much easier. Okay, that's all I got for this video. Wanted to have more of a discussion. And now the next video, we're going to do the scope of work where we build it out. It's going to be quick because we've already done all the hard talking here. So what we're going to want to do is I want to take this idea dump and put it into a scope of work that you guys can see basically how I break up these home pages and stuff like that, how we break it up and how you want to do it. I'm going to glaze over it. I'm not going into tons of detail on it because I think I've explained it well enough. And the way you decide to do it is kind of up to you, but I just want to show you guys a very high level of how you might do a scope of work. So I'll see you guys in the next video. We'll get started on that and get that complete, and that'll finish up our discovery phase.